Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today at, I think, a very important and interesting conference. I'm Joe Antos with the American Enterprise Institute, and as everyone in the room and everyone online realizes, this is an experiment. However, it's not a controlled experiment. We are going to be talking about the title of this conference is "The Cure Worth the Cost? The Debate Over the Price of Specialty Drugs," and we're going to be doing some experimental things. In particular, another part of the experiment is that for anybody watching online, we will be able to, at least in theory, we'll see how this goes. First time we've ever tried this. We will be able to field questions from the online audience today. So if you're watching online and would like to submit a question for consideration, go to sli.do and enter AEI event, AEIEVENT. It should be easy. We'll find out if it is. So they would like you to enter your name, preferably your actual name, and type in your question and submit it. And then if it goes through and if we have time, I will try to address it to the panel. Okay. So, the introduction of specialty drugs for the treatment of hepatitis C focused public attention on the cost of new medical innovations that are both highly effective and high priced. That's a big issue. What has happened in the pharmaceutical space is that we now have drugs that you could firstly call miracle cures. They're either cures or they're highly effective at treating complex chronic conditions. But of course, the age-old question, the one that we will address to some extent here, although we will certainly not answer it, is what should the price be and who should pay? The public uproar over pricing in the pharmaceutical space has obviously continued. The latest example is the EpiPen. It's an interesting example because the drug is not the issue. It's an old drug. It's the way the drug is administered. It's essentially a foolproof method to inject your child with a drug that will counteract a severe allergic reaction. So it's not just the drugs, it's also the devices. There are a lot of other things going on here that really matter. I would say that public discussion has shed more heat than light on this subject. It's a complicated subject. It's a sensitive subject. There are no easy answers. There are plenty of easy slogans. But I think that the slogans conceal more than they reveal. There's a general lack of understanding, certainly among the public, but I would say among many policymakers on many issues. For example, what is the price? What we see in the newspapers are list prices, but there are discounts, there are rebates, there are all sorts of complicated ways that the prices are that the final price is actually determined. So we don't actually know what the price is. People like to point to Europe. They say that they get much lower prices, but the comparisons are often faulty, and there are other issues related to what the price should be here, there, or anywhere else. There are lots of other considerations. Then who pays? One of the complications in healthcare is that we have third-party payment insurers, either private insurers or Medicare or Medicaid. However, people are confused about that too. When you pay your premium, guess what? You're helping to pay for your treatment. It's not just the out-of-pocket cost. It's also the premium. It's also, in the case of Medicare and Medicaid, the taxes that you pay. So who pays? Well, sad to say it, we're paying. Everybody's paying. But that is obscured by the way that we pay for things. Furthermore, what are we paying for? Well, the insurance system, which includes Medicare and Medicaid, is oriented essentially to the kind of health care that probably existed back in the 60s when these programs, when the government programs started. But they're definitely oriented to sort of 1 year. The observation is fee-for-service and sort of 1 year. We don't look beyond that. We do not consider the potential impact on health of treatments, whether it's prescription drugs or any other kind of treatment in healthcare, beyond that 1 year. And in fact, in many of these cases of specialty drugs, the benefit is very, very long term. In the case of hepatitis C, it's a cure. It's also an effective drug, and it is not, so there's a very high rate of cure, and it is also not as difficult for patients to take. So there's immediate benefit, but there's also very long-term benefit because you don't have hepatitis C. So all sorts of things now are possible for you because of that drug. Well, the pricing is based on a 1-year model. Then what about the role of pharmacy benefit managers? There's a suit now between an insurer and a major pharmacy benefit manager about whether the PBM appropriately gave enough of the discounts and rebates back to the insurer. It's a money matter, absolutely. Everybody has a role to play, but this is obviously not a settled issue either. It's worth mentioning because that also factors into ultimately to the price of the drugs and how the access to these drugs as well. Then what about the effects of consolidation in the health industry? Again, something that people usually don't think about in this context, but it's a big deal. Pharmaceutical companies have consolidated over the years. Insurance companies have consolidated over the years, although the current administration is trying to halt some consolidation. But hospitals have bought up physician practices. There's a lot of consolidation in the health space in general, and that influences decisions about pricing. It influences decisions about purchasing. It influences decisions about prescribing. What about the role of FDA regulation? Again, that's a big, big issue. One could argue that because of FDA rules, it's harder to get a generic version of a specialty drug on the market. But there are other issues related to FDA regulation. These are all issues that are intertwined with a question, what seems like the simple question of how do we pay for drugs? It's not a simple question, and it essentially touches everything about healthcare. One other aspect, of course, I mentioned hospitals and doctors, and let's not forget that there are trade-offs and interactions among the various kinds of treatments that are feasible. So again, everything is interconnected. Nothing is easy. So policy discussion, although not necessarily actual policy, has moved to what is called value-based pricing. For example, 2 years ago, Congress passed a law to change the basis for physician payment in Medicare to move to so-called alternative payment models that's supposed to be based on the value of their services. Pay for value is a very attractive concept, or at least a very attractive slogan, but how do you actually do it? What is value? It's very hard to know what value is, but there are major organizations that are attempting to model the value of prescription drug treatments, specialty treatments, to try to get a handle on that. I think this is a highly controversial topic. And again, buried in the models, there are questions of data. Are the data available? How good are the data? What do we know about the long-term effects of a new drug, given that we have limited information based on clinical trials? Given that the indications for a drug change over time as we learn more in practice about the drug. It's a very complicated matter. There are assumptions, of course. I'm an economist. I love assumptions. Of course, I love my assumptions. I don't necessarily love anybody else's. And then there's also the question of aggregate versus patient-specific. So a lot of the modeling, most of the modeling, it really can't get at a patient-specific perspective. It's very, very difficult to do that. So indeed, I think what we're seeing is a development of very useful tools, very useful information. And the question is, what is the use, and how do we use it, and who will use it? We probably won't answer those questions today either. Anyway, let me briefly introduce the panel in the order that we're going to ask them to speak, and then I'll get out of the way, and then after that we will have a discussion. So the first person up is, Steve Pearson. Steve is the founder and president of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. We're going to call it ICER. Too many nouns there. It is an independent organization that, in fact, develops these kinds of models to put a value, to place a value on various kinds of treatments. Second up is Peter Bach, who is the director of Memorial Sloan Kettering Center for Health Policy and Outcomes. He's also a modeler. He is focusing on tools that are, I think, more oriented to patients' understanding of their treatment alternatives. Third up is Tomas Philipson, who is a professor at the University of Chicago and also a visiting scholar at AEI. Tomas has his own views about modeling, and since he's an economist, well, I don't necessarily agree with him either. Let's see now. Fourth one, Scott Gottlieb. Scott Gottlieb, as everyone probably knows, is my colleague at AEI. He is a practicing physician, but particularly relevant to this topic, he was a senior official at the FDA for a number of years, and I'm sure he can regale us with all sorts of tales of how everything went perfectly under his administration. Let's see, that's Scott. Then the fifth speaker is Greg Alton, who is Executive Vice President at Gilead. Gilead is one of the big innovator companies, and of course they produced the first effective hepatitis C drug. And then finally, the last speaker is Josh Offman, who is Senior Vice President at Amgen. Amgen also is well known for its work as an innovator in the pharmaceutical space. And with that, let's see. Let me turn it over to Steve Pearson. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here and to be able to speak with the rest of the folks here. I think they picked Scott for the high chair because he clearly has the best socks of anybody. And now all of you will be looking at his socks for the rest of the day. I'm also reminded that in ancient Rome, when they were going to feed the Christians to the lions, they put the Christians in the Colosseum first and then introduced the lions afterwards. So it's a pleasure to go first. And I will probably try to do the equivalent of running very fast for the rest of the day. So let's see if, good. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, is the cure worth the cost? We're all going to try to be short so we have time for conversation at the end. And I also wanted to start with the idea that if we're not talking about cures necessarily, we are definitely talking about an epoch in which pharmaceuticals, innovative pharmaceuticals, are bringing really important value to patients in our healthcare system. This is a slide that I've used to open several of our public meetings, in which it shows that over the past several decades, and really largely linked to the introduction of new drugs, the 5 and 10-year survival for patients with multiple myeloma which when I was a physician in training was just a horrible disease because there were no effective treatments. Those that were tried had terrible side effects. Innovative new drugs have really changed the landscape for multiple myeloma, and that is something that we all should appreciate. On the other hand, both within the healthcare system and even more broadly, we are grappling with the problem of costs. And this is a slide that I actually basically have borrowed from Harvard economist Amitabh Chandra, and he did work looking at the state budget in Massachusetts over a 10-year period. What you see here are basically, and he divided it into different columns. The one here shows that, and this is inflation adjusted, all the kind of good economic background work that you would want. Inflation adjusted spending by the state of Massachusetts for health services increased 59% over that 10-year period. Now, where did that money come from? Did Massachusetts massively increase taxes? No. Taxes were increased somewhat, but the majority of the money came from cuts in every other line of spending in the state budget. So here you'll see cuts in public health, 38%, mental health, which is siloed in the state, 33%, education spending down 15%, housing, human services, local aid, public service. You can see that this is part of the economic reality that the health system overall is having a very important influence on in state houses at the federal budget level and for the private insurance market as well. So far be it, I'm not trained as a health economist, but for those of us who work in this area, we have to think, what are the different conceptual approaches to thinking about what a fair price or a sensible price, you can fill in your own word there, but a lot of quotation marks. So what are the conceptual approaches to fair pricing? Well, one is the idea that even to ask such a question is somewhat heretical, that the free market, quote unquote, determines what a fair price is. No one else need to be involved. We have supply, we have demand, etc. And obviously people will talk at length about whether in the pharmaceutical industry we have a quote unquote free market. Most people would argue that for many reasons we don't. So another conceptual approach is to think about, and you'll hear this in the public policy arena a lot, which is what are the costs to develop, including the risks of failure of new drugs? What are the costs to develop a drug? And then obviously we need to have some kind of reasonable profit on top of that. So a lot of the talk about digging down and asking for greater transparency from drug companies around their costs of development, you may think it's partly around shaming or what have you, but a lot of it is also tied to this basic conceptual approach to thinking about, shouldn't a price in some way be linked to how much it costs to bring something to market with some reasonable profit on top? Now, a third way is to talk about the potential added value to patients and to health systems of new interventions. And this obviously doesn't need to be drugs only. It could be devices, it could be tests, it could be different ways of putting hospitals and doctors together. What value does it bring to patients? And this is a way that, as you know, most of the international systems have focused their approach. They have tried to figure out a way to evaluate the value of new services to patients in the health system and to think about pricing largely, I think, linked to that conceptual approach. Whether that's the right one or not, that's the one that has been the dominant approach internationally, and it's one that the US in some ways is kind of catching up to. So I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but as you know, different groups like mine that are trying to create what we often call value frameworks, we try to figure out what are the different dimensions of that added value to patients in the health system, and how do we figure out what a fair price would be for added value. So in the ICER value framework, we start with a systematic review of the evidence on the comparative clinical effectiveness of a new drug compared to what the other options are. Then, and I'll spend a little bit more time in the weeds on the incremental cost, because that's where a lot of the discussion gets placed, which is, how much more are we spending and how do we decide whether that's a reasonable amount for any added clinical benefit. But all of us who do this are also sensitive to the idea that economic models cannot capture all of the broader elements of value to patients and to the health system that we would want as policymakers, as clinicians, as patients to have as part of the conversation. So we call these two separate buckets, we call them other benefits or disadvantages. We also have a bucket that is a very broad idea of contextual considerations around how serious the condition is, whether there have been other existing treatments available to patients or not, these kinds of issues. And for us, in a sense, we have a report that presents evidence on these different domains, and we have an independent public panel meet to debate that with input from stakeholders, and then we actually have them take a vote. Kind of like an FDA advisory committee, has no statutory power whatsoever, but it sends a signal. They take a vote on what they view, and we're actually slightly shifting the terminology here because as we go forward, we learn that the words can be misinterpreted. We're considering calling it going forward the long-term value for money. But again, that's not just the cost effectiveness, it's considering these other elements as well. And we have them take a vote on high, intermediate, or low. Now, again, briefly, we could stop here, and some systems of health technology assessment do. Looking at the long term, this is where we really try to capture everything that happens to patients, good and bad. Maybe a new drug, for instance, might prevent hospitalizations or future surgeries. We try to capture all of that. But there's also a real world, if you will, element to value for health systems that includes a look at the potential shorter term budget impact. So in our report, we have calculations in which we try to estimate what the potential could be, especially if insurers don't really kind of focus a lot of attention on the utilization management and create very restrictive policies. What is the potential budget impact for patients and doctors in the system? And we use that as a leverage to having a discussion about how do we maximize what we could call the health system value, which is that kind of dual perspective, long-term value for money for patients and the health system, but with an eye towards the realities of short-term budget impact that might need us to consider things like prioritizing which patients get treated first. Or maybe we can find savings from reducing waste elsewhere in the health system and accelerate some kind of readjustment or a lower price to help that shorter-term budget impact not have an adverse effect on other patients or on the health system. So I may go very quickly through this because, again, as a room full of economists, or many of you are, I just want to say that there are many different ways to think about a threshold for this incremental cost effectiveness part of the equation. And Tomas and I could probably share many beers over this and others because it's still something that economists have I would say, a very rough, and consensus is probably too strong a word, but there's a knowledge of different ways to think about it. So basically this is the question of if we can quantify, if you will, the amount of added health gain from a new drug, how much would we be willing to spend for that? We could all probably agree that we don't have unlimited resources, and even if something is a cure, we couldn't spend $100 million for that cure, 50 million, and then you start to realize, okay, if we keep going down, how do we decide how much we would pay? Well, you can look at how much society is willing to pay based on the size of its GDP, and that's one approach that the World Health Organization and many other groups have taken, and they've loosely said that somewhere between 1 to 3 times GDP per capita would be a reasonable threshold for this incremental cost effectiveness. In the US, that would be about 50 to 100,000 per quality adjusted life year. The individual willingness to pay literature is very messy because it depends on how you ask individual people, how much would you be willing to give up of your own salary to prevent yourself from being hacked to death at work? Or how much would you spend to prevent yourself from suffering a terrible death without your family? Or how much would you spend to keep yourself from falling out of the sky in an airplane? You get lots of different answers. But over time, in the past especially, there has been somewhat of a convergence in asking individuals how much they would pay. It's about 2 times their annual salary, which in the US, the median currently is about 52,000. So that would give you a threshold of around 100,000 per quality. And then in some ways, conceptually, in some sense, the most logical way to think of a threshold is, We want to set it at the point at which we don't want to bring things into our system and pay for it so much that we would have to lose the opportunity to use that money to create better health gains somewhere else in the health system, the idea of opportunity cost. And the most recent and best existing empirical evidence, not done yet in the United States, but done in Europe and Latin America, suggests that that's closer to 1 times the GDP. So that would send it down closer to the $50,000 per QALY in the US level. At ICER, in our work, we've chosen to use a range, not a single number, but a range from 100 to 150,000 per QALY. And I'm not going to go further into why we thought that was the range we would shoot for, but I wanted to give you some sense for the somewhat convergence between these different approaches to thinking about this, at least, as a point of policy-making discussion. So if we talk about the potential budget impact piece of this, again, just to restate the obvious, which is that new treatments of very good, excellent, outstanding long-term value may still not seem or even truly be affordable in the short term. The opportunity cost, it could also lead to short-term increases in premiums that could really cause a problem for access to other patients. So we were also, in a sense, tasked, therefore, with our own methodology to at least think of a threshold that would serve as at least a policy-making alarm bell, I like to call it. And what we've done in asking this question of what level of potential budget impact we should think about is to base it theoretically on thresholds that have been suggested by state legislation and by a small part of the ACA, in which action is meant to be taken to control costs should overall healthcare costs grow faster than GDP plus 1%. So that's the kind of threshold that we use. At the bottom there, it says that we use this as an alarm bell to suggest that policymakers should probably sit down, hopefully as early as possible, to sort out whether it truly is a problem for affordability. Maybe it's not. But we need some way to think about this more broadly in a consistent way. So for us, I'm not going to go through the numbers, but when you do the numbers, and we try to create it in a way that can be as transparent as possible, we came up with this alarm bell threshold of $904 million per year. And that's not revenue, that's net impact. And that's over the first 5 years. So it's not just a 1-year perspective, it's a 5-year perspective. Again, trying to say if it looks like a new drug or anything else would add to the net growth in our healthcare costs more than that, we should at least kind of raise our hands and say, do we need to talk about this? Do we need to think more about where this money is going to come from or not? It may be that we're not facing an affordability problem with this drug or other service for multiple reasons. So we've decided to use this partly, again, because policymakers were asking us in our reports, well, you can give us all this information about long-term cost effectiveness and now the short-term potential budget impact. How do we translate that through into what a reasonable value-based price might be if we are going to peg price to the added value that it brings to patients and the health system? So again, we use that step 1, our long-term cost effectiveness. We use the full range, 100 to 150,000, because we feel that leaves room for the integration of those other issues, the other potential benefits and contextual issues. And then again, we have this kind of alarm bell if it's applicable. Here's the full book of our work to date using this approach. It starts with Harvoni, and I know Gilead, Greg Alton may be commenting on this later, but our analysis suggested that it was an outstanding long-term value, and its list price could even have been higher to capture the long-term value to patients and the health system. On the other hand, it kind of loudly rang that affordability alarm bell, and this is no surprise to anybody. It was the alarm bell that woke up the whole country, in a sense, to this issue. But at a 60% discount, it would no longer ring even that alarm bell. So these are the numbers that we put out. Again, no statutory power behind these, but to help spur discussion amidst policymakers in the market. You can see the rest of these, most of our findings have suggested that the list price, and that's all that we unfortunately are able to work with in the public domain. We know that the list prices are not real because in many cases there are discounts and rebates. But again, when we're asking at what price it would be a reasonable long-term value, this is what we get. And just to show some distinctions, these are 3 drugs for multiple myeloma, drugs that were part of that improvement in outcomes, improvement in outcomes that I showed in the first slide. But the price that we pay at list price for that improvement seems out of alignment with, so it seems too high, if you will, for the amount of benefit that we are getting. Whereas other drugs for cancer, even like these for lung cancer, and this is in our draft report that's out for public comment, one section of lung cancer, which is treated with drugs called TKIs, they seem at list price to be aligned with the value that they bring to patients. And a separate group of drugs called PD-1s would require 25 to 50%. So again, sometimes the market gets there, sometimes it doesn't. So back to the conceptual approaches, I think we are all going to be continuing to wrestle with the fact that there is no one perfect way to decide what a fair price is. Sometimes we have to think about all three of these at the same time. It's very hard to do. But if I had to put my future as a patient, as a clinician, as a policymaker on one of these, it would be the last. It would be to say that the incentives we want to build into our market structure are to say that we want to recognize excellent long-term value, we want to reward that handsomely, and we want to be sensitive to the overall affordability of drugs, especially those that could have a very significant shorter-term budget impact. And that's just what I said. So with that, thank you, and I'm going to introduce the next Christian, Peter Bach.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to just talk about a few issues related to drug pricing and try and essentially make the case that we do need to do something. And I appreciate Joe's use of the word complicated when we discussed the landscape. I counted him saying it 7 times, but I didn't start right at the beginning. There are some things that are complicated. There are some others that are less so. I run something called the Evidence-Driven Drug Pricing Project, which is supported by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. This is based at Sloan Kettering. We do research on pricing trends and policy solutions that tie drug prices to their drug attributes. We coordinate and evaluate pilot programs, of which we have nearly half dozen in germination at this point. And we disseminate our findings in academic and lay press. Here are some examples of our work. You can see our recent report on Part B, the proposal in the upper left where I advance the idea of indication-specific pricing for cancer drugs, which has been taken up now by Express Scripts and CVS. Our Part B reports in the middle there, which we self-published and ended up being read into the congressional record. Everyone in Washington knows that does not mean necessarily that it will have policy impact. And you can see at the bottom our work on vial packaging, identifying more than $3 billion in annual waste on cancer drugs and leftover vials due to packaging decisions by U.S. manufacturers, many of which differ from the same packaging decisions by the same companies in Europe where these things are more closely followed. But here's the problem. As we see the improvements that Steve mentioned, and we do see, of course, incremental gains in a number of diseases, including in cancer. We're making low single-digit progress in cancer mortality almost every year. We also see rising prices for products. And shown on this slide is work from David Howard. I was lucky enough to participate. Over the last 20 years, normalized to a standard dollar per year, that asked the question, as we pay more and more for cancer drugs that come on the market each year, what are they delivering? What's essentially the value as measured by life years gained? And you see, if you will, diminishing returns. The cost of a year of life in today's dollars was about $50,000 for a new cancer drug 20 years ago. It's about $250,000 now. So even as we make these gains, each dollar we spend buys us less and less. And we can see this in this graph I show most often, so often that people sometimes yell "Freebird" right before I put it up. But this shows the incremental rise in these cancer drug prices that were looked at in that last graph. Standardized to standard dollar year, standardized to a month of therapy. We see this enormous inflation. So why does this matter? Now, Steve showed budget for Massachusetts. I could show budget for other states that have been hard hit by rising specialty drug prices like Louisiana. But what you see here is a recent paper from Health Affairs. I think maybe last week it came out. And what's happened with people rolling through their benefit structure in a plan year and tripping the catastrophic portion. So a beneficiary, as they spend enough out of pocket, they get to a point where Medicare starts to pick up the sort of reinsurance portion of Part D. And you can see the rise in the catastrophic spending across years. That is driven by the prices or spending on drugs. And by the way, although again Joe and others will say, oh, we can't see the real price, beneficiaries pay a price we can see. You can see it on Plan Finder. It's a free website run by Medicare. And that is the price they're actually paying in their deductible, and it is the price against which your coinsurance is calculated, even catastrophic, at 5%. And likewise, when I show cancer drug prices for infused products, those are the ASP reimbursements from Medicare. Those are the prices reported by manufacturers net of rebates. So they are real prices. They're not just fictional prices higher than what companies are actually capturing. And in fact, there's this overhang, and Steve touched on this, about what is happening in terms of the shift. Now, Steve showed Massachusetts state budget. This is a graph from the Wall Street Journal showing pocketbook effects for worker wages compared to the coinsurance and deductible costs of healthcare. Not all of this is drugs, of course. It's other aspects of healthcare as well. But for the last 3 years, the fastest rising bucket of spending in healthcare has been prescription drugs, including those infused in doctors' offices. So you can see this sort of push into the patient's pocketbook, if you will, even as real wages have not risen. So anyway, I don't know why I'm so worried about this. At least we have access in this country, right? We have the best healthcare system in the world. Probably not. Here is an analysis from Health Affairs from a couple months ago, and it asked 2 questions. Right? So adjusting for the number of people with cancer in different countries, European countries, it asked 2 questions. How much do we spend on cancer drugs per person, and how many people with cancer get those drugs? And the US is at the top of the podium on each, except not in the way you'd like. Right? We have actually the poorest access, we're here in the bottom on the left, for branded drugs of any of these countries in terms of how many cancer drugs are going to the cancer population. And we still spend, we're at the top of the chart here on the right, we still spend more than any other country on drugs, even though we have poorer access. Or you could say, well, all we need to do is fix the FDA, right? And if we just fix the FDA, we'll fix this pricing problem. Again, probably not. Every piece of evidence about what the FDA has accomplished over the last 10 years and its trends push against the notion that rising prices are due to the FDA becoming more gummed up and inefficient. All right? In fact, nearly all of the recent cancer drug approvals and many other specialty drugs have gone through pathways which are briefer than the traditional pathways of 10 years ago. Accelerated approval, expedited approval, single-arm trials with surrogate endpoints. Nearly every drug approved in oncology is an orphan. Somebody told me once that the oncology drug office looks like a casting call for the musical Annie. And in fact, the rate of approval for NDAs, this is a humorless crowd for Monday morning, by the way. That's like my best line. I don't know, maybe you guys take the FDA more seriously than I do. But the truth is the rate of acceptance of new NDAs is also rising. So if you look at the FDA and you say, okay, this is a barrier to entry, it is, of course, a barrier to entry. That barrier has definitively become lower. Timing also has improved at the FDA. And then you could say, well, don't worry, if the FDA sort of got its act together, we got more branded products out there, competition would solve this problem. And I suspect we will hear about the competition in the Hep C space today, maybe not. But here's an analysis from Kerry Bennett at the University of Washington looking in the oncology space where I obviously focus, and looking at the approvals of drugs that compete with one another by indication and their accumulation of new indications. That's what this sort of elegant graph demonstrates. And using this sort of panel data approach, Dr. Bennett asked the question, what happens when you get competition? And this too is somewhat disappointing. If a drug on the market gets a new indication, most of the industry talk will say, well, we are trying to recoup our investment, we're trying to fund future investment, which would suggest as you expand indications, if anything, you should get a price concession because this is sort of back calculated from economic needs of the company. That's not what's observed at all. New indications drive prices up about 10% instantaneously. Compendium-based indications, if you will, or uses which aren't on label but are still advocated by the NCCN and other organizations, also drive prices up. If approval of a competitor drug has a one-time decline effect of about minus 1.8%, easily swamped by the last line, the annual price increase of about 4.4%. So competition, at least in oncology, doesn't seem to be having the macro level effects we would hope it would have on price. And then we often hear, oh, don't worry. You know, we have generic entry. Something like 90% of people are on generics, or 90% of prescription fills are generics, and that's all well and good. And that would be great if we didn't see this sort of activity. And I don't remember what company makes Crestor, but this website went up as Crestor's generic came on the market from the branded manufacturer. It's difficult to read, I think, from in this. I expected a larger screen. But suffice it to say, this is an entire website designed to get patients to question their pharmacist as the pharmacist is handing them a prescription, asking for brand name Crestor. No two drugs in one class are exactly the same, it reads. In fact, not all medications work the same for all patients. It goes on, how to get your Crestor at the pharmacy as prescribed by your doctor. Ask for your Crestor by name. This is a company that will say in public, the purpose of the generic industry is to offload the expensive older drugs, to make room to pay for the newer expensive drugs, but providing this in a public website. Look to make sure you get Crestor. If it's not Crestor, let the pharmacist know. No substitutes, please. I want Crestor as prescribed. So I don't think you can sort of argue that the generics are the salvation on the back end of high prices, and the branded industry can't argue that while launching websites like this. And by the way, as a physician worried about access and adherence, the last thing I want is a patient questioning a pharmacist or a company raising doubts about the importance of a medication or uncertainty about which exact medication a patient should get, when the whole purpose of this is to prevent cardiovascular and other vascular events. I think, if anything, this may drive a few more patients back to Crestor, but it will cause a few patients to abandon on top of it, not in the interest of public health. So value-based pricing, as Steve noted, is, I think, a viable solution. And the core notion is to calculate prices for drugs that are fair or appropriate, words that I think Steve used as well. And this looks like two things it really isn't. It doesn't look like price, it looks like price fixing. It looks even more scary, European. But the difference is really that it has a sort of optional flavor. The idea, and this is the project that I've launched, the Drug Abacus, is to do something very similar to what ICER has been doing. And what I've developed is much more conceptual, while ICER has sort of on-the-ground approaches with real numbers. But is to take the multiple attributes of a drug and to put them into a calculator so that policymakers and experts like people in this room can contemplate the different ways of calculating a drug's price based on its own attributes. And this is what it looks like. This is the old version. You can see that, here's the website. You can see the new version. If you go there, you'd have to log off of Pokemon Go. But you could go here, and you can actually look at the different dimensions of a drug that you might contemplate in determining a price. Things like how much survival benefit and how many dollars for that do you want to pay? How much do you want to discount a drug's price for toxicity? Do you want to pay more for a novel drug? Do you want to pay more for cost of development or for treating a rare disease or for a large population burden of disease? And the whole idea here is, shown in the bottom right, and the new version actually has the budget on the top, is that this is an allocation problem. Right? We can afford to spend certain amounts of money on healthcare because we want to pay for other things like schooling or policing or leave discretionary income in the hands of taxpayers. But we want to pay appropriately across the range of products. And as Steve showed on his earlier slide, we don't see prices marrying well to sort of any value framework right now. And so this is a way of thinking about it, and it makes explicit trade-offs within the portfolio of drugs. These are just cancer drugs. But if you pay more for a rare disease and you want your total spending to be the same, you're going to pay less for a common disease, if you will. And so that is sort of the core notion. It has resonance with what Steve just presented at ICER. It contemplates things like side effects, quality of life, other attributes, and of course, life years gained. It also views budget as an important way of thinking about paying for drugs in total. If we had, and this is the optional piece, and this is something I wrote with Steve, if we had value-based prices, then what would we do with them? And so ICER can generate fair, appropriate prices, as they have done. But the question is, what then? As I said, it's not price fixing. The notion would be if manufacturers and insurers or the Medicare program could coalesce around these, this is a way to find prices for products that are not purely a product of these two large entities sort of bashing market forces or market power against one another, but instead paying what sounds like, to Steve's report, current prices for TKIs in lung cancer, a lot lower prices for immunotherapy in lung cancer. Thank you very much for your attention. And I guess first lion is coming.
Okay. I'm going to have the position of being between buyers and sellers on this panel. And surprise, surprise, buyers are arguing prices are too high, and sellers are arguing buyers are getting a bargain. So that's not unusual. It's not unique to specialty drug pricing. Probably occurs in pretty much every market we think about. I'm also going to be unique, I think, in being an economist. So economists are basically develop their life to studying why prices are the way they are. That's positive economics. Or what should prices be? That's normative economics. And a lot of these value frameworks are essentially normative economics of specialty drug pricing. So there's 4 questions that come in here that I think surround this debate. I see, again, repeated again and again. I'm going to address them. Hopefully all 4. We'll see how much time before I get knocked off the stage. One is that rising prices is the increase or cost of increase in spending. The second concern is with value-based pricing actually hold back drug spending. Third one is, are there abnormal profits in pharma? I think that's sort of the heart, really, of why people are upset at higher prices. They think pharma makes a lot of money. And lastly, are U.S. doing the right thing compared to Europe? So I'm actually going to argue that the reason we have increased spending in healthcare, and I think this can't be debated, there's no way arguing around this argument, is that we have falling prices. So what do I mean by that? Think of the price of health as opposed to the price of healthcare. So my example that I'll start with is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest people on the planet. He could not afford a longer life. He was very rich, he couldn't afford a longer life. He was essentially not able to buy a longer life at current prices because innovation essentially reduces prices. So Steve Jobs was in the same position HIV positive individuals were in the early 90s. They could not buy a longer life anywhere on the planet. Income hard, which reduced the price of a longer life, and now you can buy a longer life, financed many times by your governments, etc. But the important point here is that innovation cuts the price of health. Okay, it raises the price of healthcare spending by doing so. And medical innovation in general, many health economists think are the cause of increased healthcare spending. But the reason we're spending more is because health is becoming cheaper over time. In fact, brands are much more responsible for cutting prices than generics. They're in the price-cutting business, the price of cutting the price of health. And generics are essentially enabled by the brands to cut prices further once the price has been cut through initial innovations. That's very, very important, I think, to sort of put this in perspective in the long versus short run. In fact, brands reduce price regardless of what they sell their products for. So regardless of what what HAART cost in 1996 when it came on the market, it would have reduced the price of living longer than from what was there previously. What determines the price of health care as opposed to health? Well, many economists, most economists would think it's 2 things. One is the cost of production, which is not so relevant here. There's not huge differences. But more importantly, what we call the elasticity of demand. That basically is just how many customers disappear when you raise price, essentially. And if not a lot of customers disappear when you raise price, you have inelastic demand, you're going to have very high markup, presumably. If everyone disappears in a competitive market because they go to your competitor, you're going to have low margins. What doesn't determine price, and what the industry claims determines price, which is wrong, is R&D costs. R&D costs are sunk at the time you actually go to market. It doesn't matter if it costs $10 million to develop a drug or $1 billion to develop a drug. You're going to try to make as much money as you can going forward. So if you go to a VC or PE funding round of your medical R&D, essentially they're not going to look, they're going to look forward. How much profits are you going to have in the future? And that's going to determine the R&D funding. So pricing determines R&D funding, not vice versa. And the real issue with high prices in this market is not so much why manufacturers actually set high prices. The real issue is why do buyers pay? Okay, if they don't like these products, they can walk. They can't really because then they will lose beneficiaries, presumably. But the real question is, what's different about these products that the elasticity of demand is so low that no customers disappear when you raise prices? And you can live without a lot of products, but you can't live without life-saving products, and that's really the heart of cancer pricing or specialty drug pricing, that the elasticity of demand is so low because these products are essentially extremely valuable. So do we have a mispricing in the U.S. reimbursement system? That's essentially what we're talking about here. And I want to separate the discussion between private payers and public payers. So in a private payer market, and many people have argued that we have a lot of mispricing. In fact, some people argue that a third of healthcare is wasted. My response to that is, really? You think you can save $1 trillion and you still have your job as a health economist or as a policy analyst? If you can save $1 trillion, I bet you someone would bid you out from your academic job. So the issue is really that no one knows how to save a third of healthcare spending. No one has a clue how to do it. If they did, they presumably have an enormous value in the marketplace of doing so. Ex post, we can hypothesize that was the wrong treatment, et cetera, but ex ante, many times we don't know what's the right treatment. So all this discussion of waste in healthcare many times begs the question, if it's wasted, why don't someone just open another shop and actually cut prices by a third? The issue is different for Medicare because obviously in a privately financed plan, you have different incentives than for a publicly financed plan. I worked at FDA as a bureaucrat. I never got paid more when I did a good job. So basically, in Medicare, I think there's a role for having some kind of metrics. Medicare differs in its different types of program. A, C, and D of Medicare concerns hospitals, privately competing plans, and also outpatient prescription drug. In those markets, we generally have downward pressure to want lower prices. However, in Part B, as many people have recognized, we pay on a cost times basis as opposed to cost plus. Essentially, we pay 6% above acquisition cost. That makes the people responsible for administrating these treatments want to have high prices. So you're essentially in a market where customers like high prices. Surprise, surprise, in that market, you're going to get high prices. And that's what the oncology sort of issue, I think, is with Part B pricing. However, we actually see in those markets, we see a lot of low-priced drugs too. So there's some role for elasticity of demand. For example, Sloan Kettering, Peters institutions walk away from high-priced drugs. So there's clearly an elasticity of demand that's operating to keep those prices down even in those markets. Now my pointer is now, oh, there we go. So will value-based pricing cut drug spending? Is another question that we often run into. There's a huge disconnect between policy analysts that I talk to and the market in the terms of value of these treatments. In these valuation frameworks, we often see that these drugs are very highly priced and are deemed invaluable. However, we also see, because of the insurance system we have, that patients go bankrupt for these treatments. That is to say, we don't have full insurance for specialty drugs. And when people are faced with these co-pays, they many times go bankrupt for these treatments. That's an enormous demonstration of value, if anything. There's very few products that you're willing to go bankrupt for. So patients are saying with their pocketbooks, this is so valuable, I'm driving my family or relatives into bankruptcy. That's obviously a sad story with the financing system that we have, but it's a revelation of the value of these products to the patients compared to the policy community that deemed them invaluable. And that's really at the heart of this difference. How do we get patient values to be better represented in normative pricing theories such as these value frameworks? So we have done some work at the Becker-Friedman Institute at University of Chicago together with Holt and Jaffe. I wrote a paper essentially looking at, in general, forget drugs, in general in healthcare, how much do actually new innovators price their product relative to the benefits compared to incumbents in that market, the standard of care. So here's a graph that shows essentially that there's enormous tendencies in healthcare in general. Now, this includes drugs. Remember, drugs is only 12% of healthcare spending. Specialty drugs about 3 or 4% of healthcare spending. So it's not a big deal in the big scheme of things in terms of healthcare spending and state budgets, et cetera. But in this picture, you'll see essentially that close to 60%, 57% of new innovations on the market have higher prices in percentage terms than the quality that they contribute. So this is cost effectiveness, so it's price per quality unit, essentially quality adjusted prices, just as price per square foot of housing or whatever in other markets. So what this is saying is that when a new innovation comes on the market, it raises prices more than it raises quality. So let's say prices go up by 20%, quality goes up by 10%. That would lead to an increase in quality adjusted prices. This is true across healthcare. This is the ratio of the innovators' quality adjusted price relative to the standard of care. Now this is a data set from Tufts that Peter Newman actually has, and these are about 7,000 innovations compared to the standard of care. So this is across all of healthcare, essentially the universe of cost effectiveness studies. In that data, we see that innovators, regardless of if they're drugs or health, or the rest of 88% of healthcare, will essentially have higher quality adjusted prices when they come on the market relative to the standard of care. So the question is if value-based pricing, which is now we currently, like I said, spend 3 or 4% of total healthcare spending on specialty drugs. If we had value-based pricing for all of healthcare, presumably we want this outside of 3 or 4% of specialty drugs as well. But if we had that, would actually this share go up or down? My prediction would that we would be spending a lot more on drugs. We have no clue about the cost effectiveness of many procedures. Procedures are different from drugs. One, they don't have mandated evidence generated about their quality from the government, which is what FDA does for drugs. Second, there can't be patented, so there's no ownership of procedures. If you don't have ownership of a procedure, you have no one basically producing the evidence to support it. That's why we don't have evidence on vitamins or whatever, natural herbs, because no one can own them, and therefore there's no return in investing in that evidence. So you have 88% of healthcare, essentially, where you don't have outside medical products, you don't have mandated evidence, you don't have ownership generating evidence. And if we actually have value-based pricing with this, my presumption would be that we had a lot more usage of more valuable care, including drugs. The budget impact issue, which was raised several times, I think is misleading as well, because budget impact is really about the lack of credit markets. So when you buy a house, you don't pay for it cash. That would be an enormous budget impact on your budget, I assume, if you have a nice house. Same when you take a student loan. If you go to school, you don't pay your tuition up front. What you do is you borrow money through a mortgage or a student loan, and you pay it over time. We don't have sufficient credit markets in the US for healthcare, and that's the hepatitis C problem. Hepatitis C was an enormous expenditure up front, 90 grand for 3 months. In fact, it was called a $1,000 pill. I would have preferred it was a $90,000 pill, that we only took 1 pill as opposed to 3 months of pill. And so that's a good thing, actually, if we have upfront costs. But that was smoothed over. That's a long-term benefit, and you should be able to have credit to smooth that consumption out, like you do in housing, like you do in education and other markets. We don't have that with Medicaid state governments that essentially have annual appropriations, et cetera. That's a credit market issue. It's not a value issue. In some sense, we shouldn't destroy value by having inappropriate credit market. We need better financial institutions that support credit, both on the patient level in terms of co-pays, but also on the payer level in terms of state governments being able to smooth out payments over time, especially for eradication programs such as infectious diseases as Hep C. Third question, are there abnormal profits in pharma? And this is, I think, is at the heart of this. Some people think there are, some people think there not. So here's a Peter Bach versus Thomas Phillipson answer. Would you pay $100 for a 10% chance to win $100? Peter and company says, yes, I would advise you to not do that. What do I mean by that? Basically, what people do, they go and look at the R&D spending of a drug. Let's say it's $100 million. And then they go and look at it, what's the profits of a drug? And let's say it's $1 billion. And they say, isn't this absurd? We have a $100 million R&D expense and a $1 billion profit. Aren't these guys making too much money? That's missing the point between product pricing and portfolio profits. So if you have an R&D program that only wins or actually hits the market in 10% of the time, you have to make $1 billion on that drug to cover all the rest of the R&D programs. So if your pension fund invested like Peter wanted them to, you would easily drop that pension fund. You had negative returns. Your pension would be shrinking over time as opposed to growing. And so we essentially would be asking the industry to invest in ways you would not let them do if you actually proposed that they should price things according to R&D expenditure for that observed drug. So I think it's very misleading when people go out and miss the fact that the winners on the market has to finance a lot of losers that doesn't make the market. The second aspect of the risk and return of these companies is that essentially if pharma was so profitable, why are you holding anything else in your portfolio in some sense? Is it really true that pharma is that profitable relative to other firms? We did a paper that's in this year's Econometrica with Ralph Coy and Harald Uhlig at LSE and University of Chicago, where we essentially showed that there was a medical innovation program premium in U.S. equity markets. That is to say, there was about a 3 to 6% return on medical R&D spenders in the U.S. equity market. And we showed essentially that this is likely due to government risks to compensate for this. Obviously, if there was no offsetting risk to this, why wouldn't everyone hold pharmaceuticals? You get 3 or 6% larger returns every year. So there's got to be people on Wall Street, that's all they do, think about risk and returns. There's got to be some offsetting risks to this. And one interpretation is that this risk is essentially government risk that investors must be compensated for with these high returns. No one can do a sort of a focus group on what the future Medicare price will be for cancer drugs, okay? There's no way to assess the risk of your pricing in the future depending on how much government demand there's going to be. And it's very hard to also offset the risk of approval. Lastly, are U.S. prices too high relative to other countries? The important point about international pricing is that medical R&D returns, medical R&D is driven by world returns. They're not driven by country-specific returns. So I'm originally from Sweden, and I know for a fact Swedish firms do not innovate for 9 million Swedes in the world. They innovate for Medicare and the U.S. population because here's where the money is. The key implication of that is that what's good policy for the UK, which we often hear we want to mimic in the US, is not good policy for the US. Why is that? Well, essentially, UK or Sweden for that matter, we could essentially shut down both countries and nothing would happen to medical innovation, okay? Because there's such small part of world return, okay? And if you're such small part of world return, there is no innovation access trade-off in your country. If Sweden prices a cost or UK prices a cost, nothing will happen to the flow of products coming into their country. That is not true for the US. If US acts like Sweden, that will severely limit the newer products that come into US citizens that they can use in the future in terms of medical innovation. That's why this is such a weird phenomenon in healthcare. In my opinion, that's why, that the biggest buyer in the market, CMS, is paying the highest prices. Very unusual for many markets for the biggest buyer to pay the highest prices. But that's true in healthcare internationally. And it makes sense for CMS to pay the highest prices because if they acted like free-riding European nations, essentially the US population would be hurt dramatically by fewer products coming on the market. So the horse race in the future, really, I'll end with this optimistic note, is really about two forces coming down on medical innovation returns, on world returns to innovation. One is emerging markets. You have a lot more customers growing into middle income in China in particular and other emerging markets. That's a huge boost to medical innovation. Most companies are setting up shop in Asia if they haven't already. And in 10 or 20 years, which is the time it takes to develop a drug, that's going to be a larger share of demand. So that's great. The offsetting force is, of course, that markups are falling in rich countries. That is to say, with austerity measures and Obamacare, et cetera, markups are falling in the countries that are actually making up the current demand. So it's really a horse race in the future between the growing customer base, or quantity if you want, that's taking place around the world, and the shrinking markups. Which of those are going to dominate to essentially determine whether innovation is going to be more or less profitable in the future. And that will likely depend on whether US and China will act like Europe. Will they try to free ride off each other in the future? If they don't, then clearly we have a very bright future for medical innovation. But if US and China in their own presses, now they're not going to be one provider of world returns to innovation, but two providers of world returns to innovation. If they start free riding on each other and acting like Sweden and the UK, then we're going to have problems. So I'll end on that note and have the next lion or tiger? Scott Gottlieb.
Gotta get used to the new set. I'm going to try to make up some time and just offer a few thoughts on some of the debate around drug pricing. We've heard some discussion this morning about the disconnect between the list price and the real price, and I'm going to pick up on some of the discussion that's happened in the marketplace around the debate over Mylan's EpiPen. It's true that the list price of drugs, which are the focus of all of the scrutiny really, sometimes bear little relation to the real price of the drugs in the market, the actual net price. And Steve mentioned that ICER is dependent upon doing their analysis on the list price, even though that doesn't always, in many cases, doesn't represent the actual net price. And so I think trying to do cost-benefit analysis based on the list price is doing so knowing this fact is in some respects going to lead to a potentially misleading conclusion. And I will just sort of submit as an aside, the net price is available. You could look at analyst reports, typically equity analyst reports. The analysts will derive the net price for most drugs that are important to drug companies. And so the average price in the market is actually available, even though the list price is often what we talk about. But at the same time, it's also true that the list price is becoming the real price for more and more consumers. I think this is a consequence of a number of more recent trends. The first is that there is more people that are underinsured or uninsured for drugs. We're seeing more and more health plans adopt closed formularies. So we can have a discussion around why this is. I think a lot of this has been accelerated by the Affordable Care Act. But the concept of a closed formulary in the commercial market is a relatively new concept, and that's causing a lot of consumers to be fully out of pocket. So more consumers are seeing the full brunt of the list price. I think there are some genuine pricing problems in the market, particularly around single-source specialty drugs and specialty generic drugs. I would say on the single-source specialty drugs, and I think Josh is going to get into this more, I think there is an inability for companies to price discriminate. You can't vary the price based on the indication or how the drug's being used or what outcomes it's delivering. On the specialty generic side, I think there's too many inappropriate monopolies where companies are unable to bring generic competition onto the market in an efficient fashion. So you see products like EpiPen, which really should be subject to vigorous generic competition, or at least competition from other specialty drugs, effectively having a monopoly on the market, even though there's no IP that really would prevent a product from coming onto the market. But the biggest reason is that a lot of the discounting off the list price comes in the form of rebates. The biggest reason why there's more hardship around the list price is because a lot of the discounting that does happen in the market, and there's significant discounting in the market, it comes in the form of rebates that don't always flow to consumers evenly, and sometimes don't flow to them at all. And so with my brief remarks here today, I want to open up a discussion and focus on this question. Why does the discounting in the drug space take the form of rebates paid to PBMs through a very convoluted system? And I have an article up on Forbes today where I talk about this in greater detail. If you think about it from an economic standpoint, money earned today is far more valuable than money earned tomorrow. So in a rational system, you'd prefer a discount to a rebate. You'd prefer to get the money off up front rather than on the back end. And so why do we have this system in the pharmaceutical space where all of the discounting effectively comes in the form of rebates through this very convoluted process where there's a lot of people who take some of the rebates for themselves and don't always pass it on, certainly don't pass it on directly to consumers, but sometimes don't even pass it on to consumers in the form of discounts applied to the health plans that then lower the premiums. And the reason why we have this system, the people we can blame for this are the lawyers. Basically, this system grew out from the late 1990s. There was litigation brought by the pharmacies, the retail pharmacies, alleging that the drug makers were colluding because they were discounting to the HMOs but not providing the same discounts to the pharmacies. And this was allegedly in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The courts started to rule against the drug makers. These were multiple cases, they were ultimately consolidated into one class action. The court started to rule against the drug makers. So the drug makers settled the class action and moved away from discounts entirely. They were paying at the time big discounts to the HMOs as the HMOs started to exert leverage in the marketplace. They moved away from the discounts entirely and towards this rebate model. What the courts basically said is that if you offer a discount in the market, you've got to offer the same discount to all the participants in the market. You couldn't discriminate between different participants and offer different discounts. And so what they did was they went to a very convoluted process of offering rebates based on a mechanism that the pharmacies couldn't possibly attest to. So it was a rebate based on some semblance of market share that the PBMs or the health plans would achieve. And so ostensibly this rebate is available to the pharmacies as well. The pharmacies just have no capacity to demonstrate the information that they'd have to qualify for the rebate. And that was purposeful. That's how it was structured. So sort of summing up, it raises an interesting question in my mind. Could Congress legislate to make it legal for drug makers to discriminate by channel, as long as the drug makers aren't colluding based on the discounts that they're offering to a particular channel? Could they discriminate between the price that they're offering to an HMO or provider versus a PBM versus a retail pharmacy? Because there's nothing constitutional about the ruling. This is all the result of legislation. Legislation could be changed. And I think a discount would potentially be a far more equitable, far more transparent, far more pro-competitive way to offer money off in the marketplace, because there is substantial money off being offered in the marketplace off the list price of drugs. It's just not flowing directly to consumers, and it's certainly not transparent. And so the question is, if you did this, if you had legislation that freed the pharmaceutical companies to be able to offer discounts as opposed to rebates, would the system push drug companies to do that? I suspect it would in many cases. I think in the end, some of the PBMs and the HMOs and the drug makers will resist such a change, because I think the system's become accustomed to this rebate structure, and the drug makers certainly use the rebates to buy formulary access. But I think the recent issues around Mylan's EpiPen has raised some pertinent questions that are worth examining more closely. I think the market could be much more potentially competitive if more of the money off the list price was in the form of discounts negotiated up front that were more transparent than these rebates that are paid on the back end. And for the drug makers, there wouldn't be this economic incentive like there is today to push up the list price only to have the latitude to rebate the money later as a way to try to gain formulary access, but in the process creating this fictitious price that I think the industry's critics use to beat the companies up and sometimes offer analyses that aren't always accurate. So with that, I'd like to close. I hope you all take a look at my Forbes article, and I think I made up some time. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, thank you. So I'm both, I guess, a lion and a lawyer, as Scott knows, so I'm getting it from both sides here. I should have some slides. So Joe started off talking about sort of the example of hepatitis C and how it was a wake-up call in terms of pricing. I think a lot of that had to do with unit costs as opposed to actual treatment costs or value. But the discussion here is the cure worth the cost? And I look at that as the value of curing disease worth the cost. And I'll use what happened with hepatitis C as an example. So 3 years ago, this was the real-world effectiveness of a cure for hepatitis C. So cures have been around for hepatitis C for a long time. The problem with the cures 3 years ago, and these were around for a while, is most people couldn't use them, or most people wouldn't use them. They were really bad. So you had almost a built-in system of managing the supply or the demand for the product, the quantity of product used. So you had roughly, this is a chart showing a study showing out of roughly 15,000 patients, you'd only actually cure about 3% of those patients due to people choosing not to use these toxic therapies, people not actually being cured by them or being ineligible for them. So there really wasn't a big wake-up call on the cures for hepatitis C 3 years ago. But today, you can see with the new therapies, and some of the other panelists, the Christians even said this, that you do have value in the cures that actually meet many of the value thresholds. You can see here that the cost of curing hepatitis C has significantly decreased over time. And you can see on the far left there, that is the old sort of toxic regimens. Because the cure rates were so low, it would cost over $200,000 to actually achieve a cure for a patient. Move that to today, and you can look at some estimates of discounts. I can't actually disclose the actual prices. I promised I wouldn't do that. But this is assuming a 46 to 50% discount. You actually get to very cost-effective ratios. I think that was something that people said. So, in the case of hepatitis C, where a cure is really the only benefit you're going to get out of using these, costs have come down significantly with these new therapies. So this is sort of to start with the cost. However, what we do have here is the first big cure in modern times for a disease. And so a lot of the panels have talked about value, and I think I will come back to value. But we're talking about value in oncology. We can talk about value in other areas. But really, this is really the only example we have in modern times of an innovative product coming out and curing a broad disease. It's not just Gilead. There's other products out there. So one of the questions we often get is, how did you come up with the price of your products? And I think Tom would say that you priced it too low. Others people would say you priced it too high. But we actually took a very, very methodical and standard approach. The first thing we look at is the product attributes. And here with these products, we get nearly 95% cure rates across the board. So very, very potent drugs, very, very tolerable, very easy for patients to use. And we can treat all genotypes. Hepatitis C has 6 genotypes, and that's where we are today. Very importantly, as in most pricing of products, we look at what are other similar products priced at. And the similar products we looked at were the products that were on the market at that time. And if I move to this slide, you can see in the gray, these were the products that were on the market to cure hepatitis C at the time we launched. And you can look at the relative pricing of our product versus theirs. But we essentially price our WAC price or list price based on those old therapies. We almost matched it exactly. Now, what that actually resulted in was a high unit cost, which I think people really grabbed onto at the time of launch, and not focusing on, as Tom said, you should be focused on what does it cost to cure hepatitis C, and it's a lifelong treatment. But you can see there on the left side in the dark, those are our products. On the right were the older products at the time. Significant savings on the cost per cure of hepatitis C. In addition to that, we also spent a lot of time, because we got to these value numbers, we spent a lot of time doing market research. So I think people say, why were the payers so surprised? Well, we spoke to every payer. We spoke to and that's on the public and private side. I think that the disconnect was a couple, but number one was people didn't see the big demand coming. They saw hepatitis C based on these old therapies as something that wasn't in heavy demand. And so I think there was a surprise on the demand side for a lot of people that came in roughly 3 years ago. But in terms of, we also looked at budget impact in terms of as we were going through this. And in terms of budget impact, I think that Peter used the word allocation problem. We did understand that a lot of these payers were going to have to make some decisions within their formularies and their budgets about treating hepatitis C, because it really was untreated prior to this. So this would be a new budget for those programs. So in fact, and I'm going to fast forward a little bit, over time, what you'll see in the US and globally is a tiered pricing. So we look at different payer systems, and we have different prices for those. So the VA paying a much lower price than a private plan. Medicaid's paying lower prices, and other plans in between. Globally, we look at different countries around the world, and we adjust our prices based on, we use GNI per capita to come up with those prices. In terms of what the price was not based on, it was not based, again, I'll come back, it was not based on unit cost. I think Tom said if it took 1 pill, if it takes 90 pills, or it takes 1,000 pills, we looked at what does it cost to cure hepatitis C, and what's the value for curing hepatitis C. That's how we looked at it. And unfortunately, the media, the discussion went to $1,000 per pill, which quite frankly is irrelevant. It really is how much does it cost to cure the disease at the end of the day. We did not base, and this was, I'm following up some comments by other panelists, it was not based on the cost of R&D, and Tom said this very eloquently, you really have to flip that. The investment that Gilead made, that Merck made, that AbbVie made, that hundreds of small companies made in hepatitis C over the last 20 years was based on an assumption of what the market would be if you were successful bringing a product to market. That assumption was based on the standard of care at the time and what those prices were, what the cost of untreated hepatitis C was, and what the market size was. So you really need to look at this different. The incentive to invest is based on the perceived market. You don't look at your cost and then say, okay, now what's a reasonable return for me? And that's just how the industry works. So the challenge we had, coming back, is that the way that our health system works, and again I'm touching on something that Tom said, is that we look at, it's based on chronic care and annualized budgets. we look at caring for people 365 days a year, and we adjust budgets based on that. That's the typical way because we just haven't had big cures like this for some time. So if you look at the top of the slide here, this is sort of the typical chronic disease state. You have your payment aligned with the benefit. Take HIV as an example. We're one of the leaders in HIV therapies. Patients take a pill a day for their entire lives for HIV. It works extremely well. It suppresses the virus. They can live a long, normal life. Our budgets have an easy time adjusting for that because we know that on an annual basis, you pay for this almost like Tom used the buy a house with a mortgage. This is more like renting. You pay your rent every month and you move on. That is how the system is set up. If you go down to HCV on the bottom, you've got a large payment up front for a benefit that extends out for a lifetime of the patient. Our system really wasn't set up for these types of value, of innovation, this type of incentive to invest. So this is where the challenge was, and it's really highlighted by what we're seeing today, now roughly 3 years into this, between different payer systems. If you look at the private plans and you look at the Medicare Part D plans, they've actually done quite well for a number of reasons. Competition has brought prices down with other companies coming onto the market, but also adjustments in formularies, adjustments in their financial systems. So they've actually done quite well. I was on a panel at the Milken Institute last year, had some CEOs and some senior people, and Peter, you're on this panel, basically saying hepatitis C works well for us. But contrast that with Medicaid. Very, very different situation in Medicaid because they don't have the ability to adjust things. They have to make allocation decisions within Medicaid. And I've had many conversations with Medicaid directors who simply say, the problem is this is a new cost that I wasn't paying for before. I don't have additional budget for this. I would have to stop paying for something else to pay for hepatitis C, even though I can agree with you that it's value-based and has best great return on investment. So that's one problem that we have with the Medicaid. The other problem we have with Medicaid, and this is something that other panelists have alluded to, is that looking at the benefit of the cure, a lot of that benefit is out in the future. And the benefit will go to other systems, notably Medicare. And so a lot of the Medicaid plans say, well, that's great. I can have all these savings in terms of reduced liver transplants and hepatocellular carcinoma, cirrhosis, management of cirrhosis. But most of that benefit's going to go to a different payer. That's not something that I can actually really see in my time horizon. So that's a big problem. What's the solution in Medicaid? Well, take a look at what the VA has done. So the VA is a similar system. They've also gotten competitive pricing and they've got the reduction of cost, but they actually get funding. They're actually getting additional funding to take on hepatitis C. And that's probably the challenge a lot of the Medicaid programs have is it's not a value, it's not cost effectiveness, it's how they pay for this new innovation. So talking about value frameworks, I would say that they're very important, and I don't think it's something that we should shy away from. I think they have to be done correctly, but I also don't think that they will necessarily solve the problem. And the reason I would say that is you take a look at examples brought about NICE in the UK, what people consider one of the most stringent value assessments that you have. NICE actually gave us the thumbs up for our hepatitis C cures. So we got that, we thought, okay, this is great. The problem is it's the budget issue, and this was alluded to by the Christians in the room, which is the NHS said, okay, we see this may be cost effective, this may have value, but we just don't see it fitting into our budget. So if you go to Europe right now, many of the countries in Europe, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, are actually broadly treating hepatitis C. The UK is held out, even though their own stringent health technology assessment gave us the thumbs up. And I mentioned Medicaid also as an example of where it's not working well. So I think these are important, but they don't necessarily solve the problem. The other thing I'd say about value assessments is, particularly if you look at hepatitis C, you need to take a much longer view than I would say 5 years because the benefits of hepatitis C can extend out. And that can be for a lot of other cures that we're looking at as well. So I think we need to be careful about setting finite time horizons. I think you need to look at longer term than that. In addition, we need to look at, I know Peter has included this in his abacus, which is we need to look at incentivizing innovation as part of this. You saw some of these slides on oncology and other therapies. I use the example of HIV. The first drugs to treat HIV actually didn't work very well. So this is AZT, D4T, other drugs like that. They didn't work very well, but they were reimbursed at a pretty high level. What that did is it allowed companies like Gilead, we were actually a startup company at that time, to actually get investment. We got that investment, and now that investment cycle, that reimbursement, has allowed us to develop new therapies for HIV that actually do not cure the disease, but essentially allow a person to live a long life and live pretty healthy. So we need to have innovation into these value assessments. They need to be long-term. And then finally, and in this, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement, but we need to include patients in this and how patients value the innovation, how patients value a cure. And we talk about, is a cure worth the cost? I think it's, anybody would agree that you'd rather be cured of a disease than to take a pill a day for it. So we need to be thinking about how patients would react to the value of a cure in and of itself, and then obviously the side effects and other elements within a medicine that will go into a patient's view of value. So to me, the real challenge is, so I don't disagree with looking at value as part of cost and utilization of a product. But the real challenge, coming back to something I said before, is the financing. It's how we budget for healthcare. And I think a lot of people have said that we need to look at costs and I forget the exact word you used, Stephen, but, or maybe it was you, Peter, with the warning signals if it's having too much of an impact on budget. Well, that happened in hepatitis C. I mean, it's clear that we had a huge bolus of patients built up, and it put a big strain on the budget. But maybe the budgets are the problem. Maybe it's how we budget. Maybe it's how we look at financing a cure that's the problem. We're trying to fit a cure into a budget for chronic disease as opposed to making a budget work for a cure. As I mentioned, the private plans have actually done a pretty good job of this. Others have not, so we just need to take a look at that. So to wrap up, I think the challenge is looking at creating a health system that with value, with budgeting, that can invest in short-term healthcare interventions with highly valuable long-term outcomes, rewarding the innovation that goes with that. And I think to do that, we need to encourage and reward the innovation that we want. And in this case, it is cures. I think we want to encourage more cures. So that's important. Obtain the highest societal value as we do that. We want a health system to have a budget that we can look at those long-term outcomes. And again, coming back to finish, really looking to the patient, making sure that what we are encouraging, what we're investing in, what our health system is structured for is looking at what's best for patients. Thank you.
So we've got Lions and Christians. What do they call the last person up? Not quite sure. Anyways, Joe, thank you for having me today. So we've heard a lot today about the challenges that we're facing. I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. You've been very patient. But I do want to make a couple provocative points and also address some of the real challenges that are facing us today around the overall cost in the healthcare system. Whoops. Are my slides up? What am I doing? Any luck? Just talk about Scott's words. Yeah. Scott wrote this great article. Let's just give him a second. Nope. There we go. Okay. So, the conference today has asked a very important question, one we all need to stare into. But I would ask whether we couldn't reframe this question, and rather, shouldn't we be asking ourselves, can we afford not to provide access to innovation that can reduce the burden of illness? As many, many health economists write frequently, making decisions based on our short-term budgetary lens can lead to poor long-term outcomes. And we've all seen that. And essentially, in healthcare, what this would do would essentially leave tremendous benefits that could accrue to society on the table. So we just have to be very thoughtful about that. In my view, the greatest challenge we're facing with healthcare costs right now is that all of us are looking at this problem through a very narrow silo. In fact, focusing on our short-term budgetary challenges. And this simply misses the larger picture. The common enemy of the room here is the rising and growing cost of managing the consequences of these very serious diseases: heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. It's the economic burden of these diseases, not the prices of our innovative therapies, that threaten to cripple the healthcare system in the United States. It will certainly make healthcare unsustainable if we don't increase our innovation and address diseases like this. And as a physician, the numbers on this slide are simply unacceptable. And this is why at Amgen, and for myself personally, why we come to work every day trying to stay at the forefront of bringing new innovative treatments to these patients. These numbers are unacceptable. And that's why I often mention that biopharmaceuticals are likely one of the only viable solutions to this larger problem that we have in healthcare today. But certainly there's a need to better understand the value that these drugs deliver to the healthcare system. So the challenge is very clear. There's clearly a focus on our short-term spending, particularly in state and government settings. But we happen to live in a time of unprecedented innovation, where we are literally on the cusp of a revolution in biotechnology and human genetics. We're delivering major improvements in immune therapies, in cancer care, with biologic vaccines and novel agents based on insights that we're gleaning from human genomics. So it is this tension on this slide that we must deal with. But we won't be able to find solutions by thinking about this in our silos and only focusing on drugs. We have to consider healthcare much more holistically. Now, you've heard today from Steve and others that we need to cap biopharmaceutical spending, that we are simply spending too much. But I would like to challenge everybody in the room and ask you whether any of you know what the right amount is to spend on biopharmaceuticals. How much should we be spending? So biopharmaceuticals are clearly some of the most valuable interventions that we have in healthcare, with the highest burden and hurdle for evidence of quality, safety, and efficacy, in a system, by the way, where we know for sure that the prices will come down. We know that spending is quite moderate. These are predictions over the next decade. And we know that specialty drugs, biologics in particular, are the drugs on the forefront of personalized and precision medicine, treating our most vulnerable patients with the most serious diseases. And just to continue to put these costs in perspective, on an average year, we spend on specialty drugs in this country about what we spend on dental care. So hopefully that puts that in perspective. We know that drugs offer value, and the offsets are clear. We save it, for every dollar we spend on biopharmaceuticals, about $3 to $10 are saved elsewhere in the system. We also know that drugs have been replacing the scalpel for decades. And we have to ask ourselves honestly, wouldn't we be better off in a world where medications treated most of our diseases? I think people would want that. The waste in the system has been mentioned already. It's enormous, it's hard to get to, but I would certainly hope we are focusing on this before we implement policies that could threaten our national innovative capacity. So what about the value frameworks and the value systems that we've been seeing? Peter Newman, a health economist from Tufts, has written recently, "This is early days in the US, not ready for prime time, and there is still a lot of work to do to get this right." The first thing to remind everybody, there is no single answer to the question of value. Value is a dynamic concept. Value changes over time. These analyses Steve's referring to try to estimate value require enormous numbers of assumptions, often very different ones. The intent of these types of studies and analyses is to identify where the largest uncertainties lie, to inform a robust dialogue about value, not to set prices or define price ranges. ICER doesn't know the value-based price of a drug. I don't know it, and nor does anybody else. Now, the next most important thing is we cannot confuse the concept of value with budget impact. Budget impact has nothing to do with value. You've heard about that today. Budget impact treats biopharmaceuticals like a consumption good, not an investment good, and when used for access and pricing purposes, will result in poor decisions on behalf of patients. Budget impact is about volume, not value, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish in healthcare today, where we're trying to move to value. Finally, cost effectiveness analysis is a useful tool to inform these conversations, but to make statements about value, you must impose thresholds. Now, Steve talked about the thresholds that ICER uses, the ones recommended by the WHO, with approaches very similar to price-controlled markets outside the United States. And he mentioned that the literature converges around those numbers. But Steve, honestly, there's a much broader literature than that. And we have a lot of literature directly from US adult patients and how they value a year of life. And I found at least 5 recent papers that show that they value years of life much more than those thresholds you mentioned there. In fact, often well above $300,000 for a year of life. They'll also pay significantly more in premiums for more access to specialty drugs. So we cannot not really investigate the preferences of patients themselves. If we discount those actual patient values, then we will certainly misrepresent value using this approach. It's critically important. What this all tells me is that we have a lot of work to do still before we understand whether we should use thresholds and what those thresholds ought to be. But none of us, groups like ICER or anyone else, should be paternalistic when it comes to patient values. We should simply do the important work that needs to be done to understand the values and the social values of patients themselves. And finally, there is a lot at stake for patients in this type of analysis and this type of work. So we have to maintain this as a scientific dialogue. This is actually scientific work, and not fall into a public relations campaign with unnecessary ringing of alarm bells. This serves no one's interests. So the main point here is that despite a lot of rhetoric, nobody knows the answer to the question of value, and there is no one answer. And nothing makes this point better than Peter Bach's Drug Abacus, which is a very thoughtful tool developed by he and his team. Peter used the abacus to assess one of Amgen's products, a drug for acute leukemia called Blincyto. And what's great about this tool is you can go in and you can actually change many of these important elements. Now, Peter stated in the Wall Street Journal that the price of Blincyto shouldn't be $56,000 per month, as his tool calculated, but should really be $12,000 a month. And what's nice about the tool is what we did here is we just went into the most recent version of the tool, and we gave it a toxicity penalty and modeled its efficacy, and we got to about what Peter got, which was about $14,000 as opposed to $56,000. Now, this all intrigued me, so I asked several independent experts to go into the tool and use it themselves with what they knew about the FDA label for our product. And the FDA label for Blincyto actually says it's a breakthrough product. It got a breakthrough designation, a completely novel mechanism of action for an incredibly rare and uniformly fatal disease, acute leukemia, that had no effective treatment options, so to speak. So if you go into the tool and you just say, well, I value everything sort of in the middle, you get to a price of about $242,000 per month. And I would assume at that point, Peter would have told me, Josh, you really messed up the price of Blincyto. You should have priced that much higher. But then I went back into the tool and I said, boy, but what if you really actually valued a lot the opportunity to treat a very rare and fatal condition with a completely innovative product? So Blincyto is a bispecific monoclonal antibody, the first ever brought to clinic to treat humans. Bispecific means it has 2 different monoclonal antibodies attached to each other. It's an immune therapy for cancer. And so I said, what if we really gave that a lot of value while holding things like the cost of development and the population burden relatively modest, and you get to well over $1 million. So the point here is that there is no single answer to the question of value, and that these assessments, while important, are one component of a very complex equation. So where do you go from here? Well, let me tell you where Amgen's focused. First, as you've heard today, there are a lot of differences in opinion about how to assess value. We need to align around advanced methods and approaches to value. We need to have a real conversation about value and how to reward and incentivize innovative medicines. And what I mean by advanced methods, Peter made an interesting comment today. He looked at the median survival of cancer drugs relative to their prices and showed that we're paying more for less. Well, Professor Howard and others have recently published a different analysis in Health Affairs this last week, looking at actual data from the SEER Medicare database and actual costs, looking at the average, which means looking at actual life expectancy of new cancer drugs in 4 of the most common tumors. And when you look at the actual life expectancy, not the median effect reported in clinical trials, you get a very different answer. In fact, he found the value of years of life from $50,000 to $70,000. High value through any lens. Secondly, we have to enable value-based partnerships through policy reform. And what I mean by policy reform is we have to modernize Medicare coding so that we can get to Peter and Steve's idea about indication-based pricing. We have to enable better business-to-business conversations between manufacturers and payers to align around value. And we have to think about the anti-kickback statute and Medicaid best price to enable more innovative contracting. Finally, we have to really stare into pharmaceutical benefit designs. We need to make sure they are non-discriminatory and value-based. We must quickly move to insurance designs that don't result in punishing our most vulnerable patients with high coinsurance rates simply because their biology requires them to use a high-cost biologic therapy. That simply makes no sense, but that is what is happening today. We need to ensure a robust and competitive generic marketplace to support the innovation ecosystem that we so depend on. And you heard Peter and Scott mention this. This is critical. And we must work harder together to align incentives throughout the value chain, to eliminate some of the perversity among the incentives in our value chain and drive more value through the system. I don't have all the solutions, none of us do, but there is a lot that we can do together because we can work together to improve population health, do it as efficiently as possible, and provide a very fertile environment for innovation. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was really a great positive close. Of course, I'm an economist, so I'm not really comfortable with positive closes. But before we get to that, I have a feeling that Steve and Peter would like to make a comment or two. And theoretically, we should just be able to stay seated.
Yeah, all right, I'm on.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Oh, I want to clarify. Thank you, by the way. I get paid per click on Drug Abacus, so thank you for driving traffic. Just to be fair, the article in the Wall Street Journal, the reporter, who I think was Peter Loftus, if I remember correctly, set the parameters for the purposes of that article. I never said that Blincyto had a specific price that was appropriate or not. And as you've demonstrated, you've unfortunately only shown half of the Drug Abacus in your illustration, but as you've demonstrated, the whole idea is to think about the different vectors of value and manipulate them and contemplate what they would do to prices. And absolutely, you can drive up the price or down the price of anything by moving them. It's math. What you left out was the bottom right corner on the slide I showed, and what's the top of the screen now, which is the budget. So within the Drug Abacus, there are 54 cancer drugs, and the budget is based on current US spending for those drugs. And so as you manipulate any particular parameter, it actually changes the price of all 54 drugs in most cases. And so I haven't done the math here, but at its baseline, it's set to the current spending or 2014 spending, which is about $22 billion on those 54 drugs. My estimate, just sitting here, and I don't know every single drug, is that by the time you got to your end where it was what Blincyto was worth $1 million or something like that, you'd probably driven up spending across these drugs well into the $500 billion range.
Nobody was proposing that the price should be changed.
No, I appreciate that. But this is why I said from the get-go, this is really an allocation problem. Unless you disagree with the premise that we should have a cogent, transparent, homogeneous approach to finding prices that are based on drug attributes. If every drug gets a bonus for its own little feature, or in some cases important scientific breakthrough like blinatumomab, then it should apply to other drugs that have that feature. You shouldn't sort of get a lot for treating a rare disease and get a lot for treating a common disease, because those two things are two ends of a seesaw. So if you want to read, we're happy to help you redo that slide, but you should show the budget impact on blinatumomab and all cancer drugs.
I
That's all.
So just really briefly, I would also just say that what I really find positive is that we seem to be having a discussion around value that can be much more transparent than it has been. It doesn't mean that we're going to agree, but part of my hope is that going forward, innovators will come forward with a price and be able to show not just, because the verbiage is easy. The verbiage is we priced it to value for patients in the system, but we show our numbers, show us your numbers, because the real discussion around how the public can engage with this is to see for PCSK9s, the list price was $14,600, I think. Yeah. The street was guessing $10,000. Why wasn't it $20,000? If it's a great drug for patients treating an unmet need, why 14? Why not 1,400? Why not 140? Let's all wrestle with that in the public. And I know that there are competitive issues, but when a drug is coming out, it should be something that I hope we can have more of the kinds of actual discussions around numbers that would ultimately help.
And I completely agree, Steve, just on the PCSK9, it is important for everybody to recognize there are multiple analyses out there. So when we priced the PCSK9s, it was indeed priced based on value that was calculated in economic models that are now published. The ICER model is yet not published.
Yes, JAMA.
The JAMA article was different than the ICER model, uses a different comparator, compares it only to ezetimibe. So it's very difficult. So the idea that, we're in agreement that what you want is these multiple constructs of value, but what this shows you is what are the assumptions. And you can see there are now 3 published analyses about PCSK9s in the published literature. They all tell you very different things. They use different comparators, different baseline rates of risk, different event rates. Some you can reproduce. Steve, we've yet to be able to reproduce the event rates in those models. So, it's a challenge, but that's what everybody needs to know. There is no single answer. And we need to put these out into the public literature and have these debates.
Agreed.
So let me just make a quick comment on this point, which is what you're basically all saying is that there is no actual science in pricing any of these products. That's true for drugs. That's true for everything else. It's very unclear how you do it. So all this modeling that you both just talked about, a lot more modeling than we've actually discussed here, that's really meant to inform the people who are trying to set the price what might be reasonable, but they don't know. You don't know until you get it out in the market.
That's why it's one very important input into a complex equation, and why I have been proposing that when we think about these economic analyses, cost effectiveness analyses that is filled with so much uncertainty, that's what they should represent, is an important piece of information to inform that more robust discussion, not to tell the world what the price must be or to define a value-based price range. That would be an inappropriate use of information with so much uncertainty. And so we just need to use the data appropriately.
Peter,
Well, how about
if you want, I'll go.
Well, how about
Yeah, I
Tomas
don't want
first,
to.
and then-
Go ahead. Tomas was
And
waiting.
then Peter.
So I'm cringing.
then Steve.
I'm cringing listening to this. I probably cringe as much as oncology surgeons cringe when they hear economists talking about oncology surgery. So basically, what these things are is what's economists call hedonic pricing framework. So hedonic pricing was developed by actually the late Chicago economist Sherman Rosen, which basically talks about what are the implicit prices of characteristics in the market. It was initially developed for housing. So what's the price per square foot, holding the distance to the water, to the commute, whatever, everything else constant. And in those frameworks, the whole name of the game is clearly what are the weights. So really what are the weights on the characteristics is really what you can pick up through market prices, essentially, according to Rosen's techniques. But here you have a harder time doing that because it's publicly priced, essentially. But the question is really who determines those weights. And the question is, are the people actually putting down money determining the weights? That would be payers. Or are there third parties determining those weights, which would be people like us? And I would steer away from people like us anytime in the future. So I think, if payers adopt this, that's certainly valuable for them if they want to use this as a tool. I mean, obviously, That's something they are free to do. But in terms of the value, I think also an important perspective here is, I think the profitability issue is really the issue here, because if pharma companies were going belly up and bankrupt, we wouldn't be sitting on this stage. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't. So the profitability is really, are these guys making too much money? That's really at the heart of this, because why focus on 3 or 4% of spending if that's not the issue? Why not focus on the other 96% if you want value-based pricing? Why focus in on this small part of the healthcare sector if that's not the issue? And a lot of evidence sort of tells us that pharma is not getting a lot of the value they generate, so they're not really profitable relative to the value. So take Stephen's lower bound on the value of a life here, 100 grand. Look at Heart when that came on the market. Let's assume Heart, for the sake of argument, generates 10 years extra living, which is a very small number relative to the treatment effects that we currently see. That's $1 million per patient. If you have a flow of patients over time, that's 1 million patients roughly. That's $1 trillion of value right there. The HIV market is a $4 or $5 billion market per year, tiny. So we actually calculated innovators get about 5% of the health value they generate in that market. Very simple, sort of back of the envelopes give you those numbers, give you a feel for why the numbers line up that way. You do the same for oncology, heart disease, hepatitis C, and it ranges anywhere between 5 and 20%. So the question is, essentially, are these guys making a lot of money relative to the value they generate? Do you want them to be motivated less, given that they only capture, in the case of HIV, they only capture 1/20th of the value that they generate? And that's really at the heart of this. All this other stuff is extraneous, it seems to me. It's really about, does pharma make too much money? Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to focus on a third of, 3 or 4% of spending. It seems ridiculous.
Well, Steve or Peter, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I was just going to, so I think one of the reasons that pharmaceuticals has come under increasing scrutiny is partly just the historical trend, which for a while was pretty flat or consistent with growth in the rest of the healthcare system, after an earlier phase when it had kind of been higher. And now again, there was a view, and especially looking downstream, where again, we've got that mixed feeling of fantastic new drugs in the pipeline, new science coming to bear, and that is going to mean that pharmaceuticals may be continuing to be the largest, most rapidly, I should say, growing sector of the health economy. The other piece is that I kind of feel like from the historical perspective, spending for hospitals and physicians, while still bigger than the drug spend, has now moved more towards a kind of global budgeting. It's moving ever more in a direction in which the incentives are aligned. And I know quite well, talking to hospital and physician people, they say that when they get behind closed doors to talk about prices, if you will, they talk about shared savings. How are we going to reduce the costs of care in the health system and share in that? That is the mantra, in a sense, the mindset of the incentive system for physicians and hospitals. Drugs and devices sit outside that. In a sense, they're the last bastion of you make more money if you sell more pills. And we have a system that has granted them significant pricing power during a time when, especially when they have a monopoly in the market. So I think there's a sense that as the prices are going to, or the costs are going to go up, they're trying to get a handle around the broader structure of incentives for how drugs are priced and brought into the health system seems like job one. If you talk to employers right now, it's job one for them to figure this out.
It is worth differentiating between cost and price, which I think you just did, because the real effective price in the market actually isn't going up that much, but costs on specialty drug spend are going up because more diseases are being treated with specialty drugs. And I think I see you wincing at my statement, and we're probably looking at some different data, but if you look at what's happening across medicine, and asthma is a classic example. Asthma is a disease that's been historically treated relatively inexpensively. I'm not trying to diminish the cost of the MDIs and some of the oral drugs. But now, at least for severe asthmatics, you're going to see more and more of them move on to biologics. So a disease that was a primary care disease treated with primary care drugs is suddenly going to be a specialty drug disease now in the next 5 years. And we've seen the first approval. There's going to be many more behind that. And so costs are going to go up as sort of more patients shift onto these higher cost specialty medicines, and these clinical categories get narrowed down into specialty categories. I think Peter would say, well, that's great. It's providing a lot of public health benefit. Utilization's increasing, revenue's increasing to the companies, so why don't the prices go down as a consequence? And my response to that would be that the regulatory structure, the pricing structure, doesn't allow prices to adjust that way. It doesn't allow companies to come into the market with different prices based on different uses, and we've talked a lot about this, about trying to fix those regulatory obstacles. I'm curious to see your retort on my comment about the prices, because you seem to take issue with that the prices they're going up 5%, 6%, the real effective price in the market, not the list price.
The net pricing, according to the best analyst work I've seen, is that it's still growing more rapidly than the rest of the healthcare system is growing.
Marginally, it's 6%.
So
I mean, I don't know what data.
Well, we can go, yeah,
Sure.
Swiss
We're,
Re.
we're running out of
Can I jump in
time.
here?
We're gonna let people ask questions. So thank you for being patient. But let's see who
Greg.
wants to
Greg.
speak next.
I was just going to comment on this line of thought here, because I mean the purpose of this panel is to talk about is the cost of the cure worth it, and I think if you look at hepatitis C as an example, it did increase costs for our health system, and it probably still is a little bit higher than it historically was for hepatitis C. But what you're seeing, because we're curing people, we're seeing those costs come down with the payers who've been aggressive treating early, and over time they're going to get a longer term benefit. So I think it is different when you're in the context of a cure. Take Alzheimer's as an example. We've talked about that. If we cured Alzheimer's today, we had a cure that was as effective as these hepatitis C cures, guarantee you the cost of treating Alzheimer's for a limited period of time will be higher, but you'll get that benefit long term, and I don't think we're set up for that. That's really how I look at it.
Peter.
Yeah, well, actually, I do appreciate everyone else saying what I'm going to say. I wouldn't take that bet, by the way, the 10% on $100.
You did in writing, so you don't have to take it.
Oh, I did? Okay. Well, maybe I made $100 for that.
You didn't
essay.
understand.
So,
Check the bet.
all right. But I just this issue about long-term financing, the system being incapable of paying for cures. I believe it's reverse engineered due to the budget consequences of drugs like Harvoni. And it makes, I try to step back. Again, I think cogency is important for payment for drugs and other healthcare items. And I've been trying to find an example where we do long-term financing of anything else in healthcare for the unit intervention. Of course, we finance hospitals and structures, things like that. But on the unit side, I think of so many things that doctors and hospitals do that cure patients that are paid for a unit of service, like a coronary artery bypass graft or a stent or something like that, or hip replacement. And nowhere else do we look at ways of driving up or magnifying or multiplying the price of that so that we can inspire the idea of financing that over the duration of the benefit. So you take out a gallbladder or something like that, no surgeon is going to get checks month after month. And I'm sure the proposition on the table for Hep C or something like that is not to send a check to the hepatologist who made the diagnosis or managed the treatment for the next 20 years, or the pathologist who read the biopsy that confirmed the diagnosis, or anyone else. I think the pure idea is pharmaceutical companies have complete control over their pricing, and when pricing has become outsized to any other healthcare intervention, let's find a way to pay for it over 20 years. And I think the resonance to housing markets and tuition financing are great examples. Talk about two markets that the pricing has become out of control and caused lack of access to the majority of the population. Those are great examples. So we would see where we are headed if we do something like that.
But Peter, just to comment, I agree with that analysis. I am surprised by that as well, because there are so many things we do in healthcare that we pay for up front for surgeries. This is a great example. So this is really a question for our insurance colleagues as to why it is that without thinking, without requesting value assessments, without raising this issue in the media, insurers are willingly paying these high prices for procedures, surgeries, most of which have almost, I'll say, scant evidence of benefit, paying willingly, but seem less willing to make those upfront investments in healthcare when it comes to biopharmaceuticals. And it's because they are viewing those costs in their pharmacy budget silo, as opposed to thinking about the system holistically. So that's the only conclusion I can draw. We have to ask, the question you're posing, I believe, is fundamentally an insurance question. And the reaction you're getting from Thomas and other economists who are thinking about this are reacting to the insurance companies saying, we're not going to make those long-term investments in biopharmaceuticals. So what are the alternatives? And people are trying to come up with some alternatives.
Well, it's also,
So
I
wait,
mean,
just data point, right? So Milliman, I think, had a report of the last decade in in constant dollars. Spending on cancer surgery in the U.S. has been flat. Spending on cancer biologics is up 300%.
Yeah,
Right,
there's
so-
But so is the prevalence and incidence.
I
of
mean,
Mortality
rates.
rates
So-
from cancer surgery have fallen by 60% over the last decade. That's not improvement,
mortality rates from
there-
surgery.
following surgery,
Gentlemen,
right, over the last 10 years.
Gentlemen, I think it's a little argumentative now. We've actually run out of time. So let me just say to the viewing audience, if you're still on and we're still broadcasting, which I have no idea, you will hear some questions from the audience. You'll hear some great answers. And so we'll do the applause at the end when nobody's paying any attention. But people here, raise your hand and someone will come with a microphone. Do not speak until the microphone comes in. Identify yourself. This gentleman back here. Identify yourself. Short question,
Carl
short
Polzer,
answer.
Center on Capital and Social Equity. I was very intrigued by Greg's comment about the siloing of Medicaid and Medicaid responses to the hepatitis C. And has anyone done a cost benefit or to try to see what would the benefit be to, how big it relatively to Medicare of having Medicaid cure more people for Hep C and start in other words, if Medicaid paid a higher match to the states to incentivize more of them for certain populations, could the federal government save money on Medicare? And I know for the duals, there's a lot of effort now to coordinate.
Go ahead.
Actually, I don't know the answer if we looked at what the benefit overall to Medicare. I would bet that study has been done. We have looked at Medicaid and what the benefit would be to Medicaid for treating. And I think CDC actually put out some research on this. And the prices actually do match that threshold. But the problem is the budget at Medicaid. So I think if you're going the way I've been thinking is Medicare should actually fund Medicaid on hepatitis C because they're going to save a lot of money down the road if they were to do so.
Well, one comment about Medicare, though, as everyone knows, the longer people live, the more likely they are to become expensive to the Medicare program. So it's really not at all clear, and it's the kind of analysis that's hard to do and completely disputable. Sir.
Bob Rosenblatt, National Academy of Social Insurance. I'd like to ask all the panelists, Christians as well as Lions, their view of a way of allocating spending. Some some insurers and some Medicaid programs will let you have Harvoni or Sovaldi from the very beginning. Others will require you to take the liver damage test, and only if you have a certain score would you get it. Is that required test a good or a bad way of handling the allocation and distribution of these drugs?
I bet you would respond to that. You wanna say?
I can certainly start with that. I think it's a bad way of doing it. I think you actually the economic data or pharmacoeconomic data shows that you actually get the most benefit of actually treating your broad population in terms of reducing new transmissions and in terms of getting the long-term outcomes. If you wait until there's liver damage, sometimes that liver damage can't be reversed. So I just think it's a really bad way of treating a disease, but it does get into a budget issue and most of these decisions on fibrosis scoring are around budget, not what's best for patients.
I don't think there's anything wrong with a payer putting in place certain clinical criteria on when a patient can have access to an expensive technology. I think in this setting, based on what I know as a clinician, I think it was a misguided criteria. And you're also obligating the patient to biopsies as well, which are not trivial. So I think the clinical underpinnings of the criteria in this setting was poor.
Can I jump in? This has actually, I think, shifted a bit over time because when Sovaldi first came out, it was actually required to be taken with a different drug. And clinical experts basically felt like they alone could really manage this and that the clinical infrastructure of the specialists who were experienced enough to manage these drugs and patients well was so small that they would have to focus their energies first on trying to bring in the sickest patients to get treatment. So yes, this yawning kind of budget impact was there, they could see it as well, but even just from a limited clinical expertise, that was kind of one of the reasons that some of the early recommendations, like from our public meeting, it was the clinical experts who advanced the idea that they felt they should prioritize the sickest patients first. Later, both as the budget impact issues hopefully could get spread out over time, the prices came down, the pills became easier to prescribe and to take, then you get a much more complex set of trade-offs in terms of the budget impact with the clinical infrastructure, et cetera. But that's why, in a sense, it's still, I think you would probably agree that from a policy perspective, it didn't go great with Sovaldi-Harvoni. Medicaid was squawking. VA had to go to Congress twice for bailouts. The VA went through a phase where they actually could treat nobody because they ran out of money to treat patients. They had to stop treatment until Congress gave them a new budget. Somehow we have to get a system, whether it's the longer term, but part of this is just upfronting a better understanding of the pent-up demand of the patient population and trying to figure out how we balance all these difficult issues of long-term value with the ability of the health system to absorb a short.
So I think for infectious diseases such as Hep C, right? I mean, the credit market issue becomes central because the real benefactors of these treatments are going to be people who don't get the infection in the future, and they pay Gilead $0. And essentially, they're benefiting from the lower transmission in the future. And that's why debt-financed eradication program makes a lot of sense. Because if you have debt-financed eradication programs, you have the people who benefit from the programs paying for the programs in some sense. And that's why the budget impact issue is so misguided for infectious diseases. For non-infectious diseases, a little bit different issue. But for infectious diseases, the negatives are the ones benefiting in the long run. And the negatives are not paying the innovator anything.
I'd actually, to go on that, is what the VA did, what Congress did, it was, in a sense, was like debt financing. So the VA had a limited budget. It was a finite budget. They really wanted to treat the veteran population, which has one of the highest burdens of hepatitis C. But their existing budgets were being consumed by the ongoing care of the veterans. By getting those grants from Congress, which essentially is like financing, but financed through taxpayers' dollars, the VA now has treated, probably cured about 25% of their population, probably will eliminate hepatitis C in the VA in the medium term, and will no longer be paying for hepatitis C. Right. And so I think that's an example of it actually working quite well, and it's something I think the Medicaids could look at.
I think historically people will say, well, if we did this for polio, if we did it for infectious disease through history, we would now be paying half of our national debt off for cures 50 years ago or something. I'm not saying that a debt structured over time, shouldn't be part of the consideration, but somehow, if we do that as the default for cures on a public health level, and I'm talking about millions and millions of Americans, and where do we draw the line between a cure and something that's just a really great treatment? I think we could. I don't think that by itself will solve the problem, because I think it would just push too many costs downstream in a way that would not be sustainable itself.
Well, I promised short answers. I didn't get them. Mike, we have, if you're quick about it, and then people don't talk too long. Okay, quickly. Clayton, over here. Clayton, follow my voice.
Man behind the curtain.
Exactly.
Hi, Mike Miller. I'm a physician. I'm the Senior Health and Life Science Advisor at Foley Hoag. I'm going to take a little bit of issue with something Steve said about how the pharma industry is not stepping up to be part of the value-based, risk-sharing sort of movement in healthcare, which I agree is going on at hospitals and doctors in a slice of the U.S. healthcare system, the progressive slice. There are a lot of hospitals and doctors out there who are still waiting for Obamacare to be repealed because their patients think it already has, and they're not in that mindset. But there's a lot of regulatory and legal prohibitions and limits and barriers to the pharma industry getting into these value-based arrangements, whether it's FTC, FDA, CMS, all sorts of things. My analogy is, we brought up the buying versus renting, and also for the payers, getting into those arrangements, there's a lot of challenges around churn. If I'm going to take a long-term risk arrangement for a patient for an expensive treatment, but that patient's going to go to somebody else, that adds another level of complexity. So my question is for Joe. When are you going to have another conference to address these real on-the-ground challenges for the pharma industry to get into sort of the value-based, that'll take down those barriers to the pharma industry getting into more extensive value-based, risk-sharing kinds of arrangements with payers and providers?
I'm waiting until all of our technical problems are resolved. And with that, please join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful discussion.